right in. To continue, perfect circle. To continue with the class's tradition of highly accurate scientific drawings, this is a single cell. Some DNA in there. And basically all the cell has to do to be happy is maybe take some fruit in and excrete some waste out, and it's perfectly happy. Not terribly interesting. Let's not be judgmental because the cell might not have feelings, but there are people who spend their lives studying things like this. However, when you get many cells together and have a multicellular organism like myself, things get a lot more interesting and also a lot more complex. The reason why they get a lot more complex is because suddenly all these cells, like up to 100 trillion cells in the human body, all have to communicate with each other. They have to know what the other cells are doing. They all have to be on the same page. And as we know, communication isn't always an easy thing. Some of our parents or people in our family have spent decades trying to figure out how to do this. The cell might not have feelings, but there are people who spend their lives studying things like this. However, when you get many cells together and have a multicellular organism like myself, things get a lot more interesting and also a lot more complex. The reason why they get a lot more complex is because suddenly all these cells, like up to 100 trillion cells in the human body, all have to communicate with each other. They have to know what the other cells are doing. They all have to be on the same page. And as we know, communication isn't always an easy, and it's not easy. For people who major in communication, it's not easy stuff. However, trillions of cells in our body are able to be perfectly happy, in harmony, live together, so it's possible. So we're talking about communication, and there's a lot of different ways cells can communicate. Last lecture on Monday, we talked about neuronal communication. That's when neurons communicate by sending with action potentials and neurotransmitters. Other ways cells can communicate is cell-cell contact. That's like if I were to pass you a message, so this is a message and I'm going to pass you a message, that's like cell-cell contact. If you're whispering to your neighbor, to a bunch of your neighbors, that would be what we call paracrine communication. You don't need to know this, but just to give you a sense that there's different levels of communication. So let's pretend we're one giant multicellular organism. You handing a note to your neighbor, that's cell-to-cell communication. You whispering to a bunch of your neighbors would be paracrine communication. We've talked about neuronal communication. That would be if, for example, you text your friend over there. That's really fast and nobody hears it. I'd really kind of do that, so please don't. But that's what neuronal communication would be like. And finally, when one of the TAs sends all of you guys an email, that would be endocrine communication. And that's what we're going to focus on today. So we've been jumping around from bucket to bucket in this whole class. And I want to make it a little bit more fun. So here's today's bucket. And it's full of candy. Don't get too excited, it's more complicated. If anybody has taken CS26 in the fall, they probably wondered like me what it feels like to throw candy around from 200. It feels great. Okay, back to the endocrine system. This is today's bucket, and we're kind of going to talk about the basics. And Professor Sapolsky on Monday is going to take it a whole step further and talk about really awesome things from there. So for some of you who've taken the bio and the home bio course, this might be kind of a good overview with lots of candy. For those of you who haven't taken much bio, this will probably be like a crash course, lightning speed course in the endocrine system. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start talking about the nuts and bolts of the endocrine system, who the key players are, what an endocrine signal looks like at the molecular level. That's going to be pretty brief. Then I'm going to try to put it into the whole body, look at what this system actually does in our body, how it plays out. And then we're going to talk about the role of the brain in the endocrine system as a regulator, perhaps, but then we're going to actually try to look a little bit further and see how the brain is actually influenced by the endocrine system as well as regulated. Okay, so let's jump into the nuts and bolts. The first thing we're going to talk about is what the endocrine system actually is. So we've talked about this whole the analogy of somebody sending an email or somebody shooting a text or somebody handing over some candy like this. This is cells have contact with you. An endocrine signal is a signal that travels through your blood so that every possible cell in the body can access it. So let's imagine I'm an endocrine, a cell in an endocrine organ, and I release some signal in the bloodstream. Every cell that might be interested in that signal can then read that signal because, okay, so what are these signals called? They're called hormones. We've all heard of them before, and they come in two flavors. I'm going to talk about what those two flavors are. You might not be terribly interested in the actual chemical structure of them, but it turns out that the differences in structure between these two groups of hormones is really important for how the hormones act, and that'll be important later. I'm going to erase this word because it's not very important. Okay, so the first big category of hormones is called a peptide hormone. Peptide. So if you remember from our molecular genetics, peptide is just a chain of amino acids. Peptide is kind of like a protein. These hormones are made just like proteins. There are genes for them, etc. Okay, why is that so important? Proteins are, amino acids are charged molecules. They have a positive charge or negative charge. And that means that they can actually travel freely in water. That's the only thing I need to know about this charge thing. Peptide hormones are charged, so I'll draw them with a little charge. And they can travel freely in water. Your blood is made out of a lot of water. So peptide hormones are happy in water. The scientific term for that is hydrophilic. Hydro means water, philic means that they love it. Okay, why are we interested in this hydrophilic thing? Well, first of all, they travel freely in the blood. So you release your peptide hormones and they're just cruising along down the bloodstream, very happy. And then, what does the peptide hormone do when it reaches its target cell? It carries out its message. Okay, let's look what happens. So, this is your target cell. A hormone comes, let's say this is your peptide hormone coming in, just like that. I don't know if Professor Spolsky talked about this. For those of you who've done bio, it's very obvious. The reason why cells are able to be cells and have like an inside that's separate from an outside is because you have this membrane here that's made out of lipids, fats. And you can think of lipids and water as being opposites. When you put a drop of oil in a glass of water, they're basically very different substances and they don't mix. And that's the reason why we have cells. Same reason as oil and water. So this loves water, it's hydrophilic. And I just told you that oil and water don't mix. So the key point here is that this peptide hormone, which has a charge on it maybe, will not be able to cross the membrane. So what it does is it binds to a receptor. But it never travels through the membrane. Okay, that's all we need to know about peptide hormones. Here's some examples of peptide hormones that you've heard about. Insulin, glucagon, oxytocin, vasopressin, those are all peptide hormones. Cool. Okay, so what's going to happen now is this peptide hormone is going to bind to this receptor. Excuse me, it's never going to pass through the membrane, but it will activate what we call a second messenger cascade. That's a technical term. Basically, all it means is there's a relay pathway. This peptide binds here, something happens here without this peptide ever going through, and then some other protein inside the cell is going to respond to this change on this end, and then a lot of other changes and all kinds of stuff going on inside. But this peptide hormone is acting as a relay. It never goes inside. Okay, that's peptide hormones. So we're good with peptide hormones. The next class is steroid hormones. Steroid hormones you've heard about are like testosterone, estrogen, things like that. They're not made of peptides. They're made from a precursor called cholesterol. You've heard a lot about cholesterol as well. Basically, cholesterol is not charged. Think of it more like a lipid. I think it's derived from lipids. I'm not exactly sure how cholesterol is made. The point is, steroid hormones are made from cholesterol, and so they, unlike peptide hormones, can't travel freely in water. They're not hydrophilic, they're hydrophobic. They hate water. And so they can't travel freely through the bloodstream. However, there are hormones, so they must travel somehow through the bloodstream. The key there is that these steroid hormones need chaperones. They're going to be escorted. Just like when we had parties in high school, we had things called chaperones to make sure we were safe at our parties. chaperones here are making sure that steroid hormones are safe in the bloodstream, not going crazy and doing all that crazy stuff. Okay, so they need chaperones to travel through the bloodstream, and what happens when they finally reach their target cell? Okay, can somebody try to predict for me what's going to happen once they reach the target cell? There's your little steroid.
Into the cell membrane.
Yeah, into the cell membrane. Why might you do that? Let's see if I can end it. I'll try in just a second. This is my first try. So why might that be? Why might it pass through?
Because the cell membrane is also hydrophobic, and so like attracts light. So
Great, exactly. This is basically made of similar kind of stuff as your cholesterol precursor hormone, and it can travel, it can diffuse freely through the membrane bilayer. So what happens next? A lot of times these steroid hormones will travel through the membrane, bind to some receptor protein here inside the cell, and together, here's the receptor with the protein, and together this complex will act as a transcription factor. You know all about transcription factor, and hopefully I've just kind of tied back some of the previous stuff from lecture and previous lectures to this whole hormone stuff. So here, this acts as a transcription factor directly. Very important stuff. Okay. Next, let's see. Oh, also I want to say, if you ever have a question, obviously feel free to interrupt. I'm kind of going to go as fast as I can, but feel free to interrupt if something's not clear, and you will be rewarded with candy and also hopefully with an answer. But at least candy, so it should be good for the questions. Okay, so a thing that's come along in class many times is the idea that you can't only, when you're talking about signals, you can't only look at the messenger itself. So historically, if you started reading the Zebra's book, you might have seen that this in chapter 2. Historically, people have thought of, when they're looking at hormones and diseases or individual differences that might arise through hormones, people used to think that it's all about the messenger. So this led to some crazy stuff. For example, people thinking that they could enhance their masculine traits by taking testicular extracts from animals, because they thought there's something wrong with my testosterone, there's something wrong with my masculine message. I'm going to take like testicular extract from bulls and monkeys, or I'm going to get like a testicular graft from animals. That's all that crazy stuff. Never really worked. And if you were going to ask me whether I want to do that, I'd probably say no, and I'd probably want to think back a little bit first before I do that. We'll talk more about that later. Not the testicular stuff, but the thinking back part.